Dragon Ball villains are often accused of being too similar in their motivations or being overtly evil. While the former isn't necessarily true, see my Piccolo Daimao video for that. And how good or bad the latter is depends on context and characterization. There are two villains from separate spin-offs of the source material that break trends to some extent. Those are, of course, Baby from Dragon Ball GT and Zamasu, or Goku Black, from Dragon Ball Super. The difference in their execution, however, shows how one made the right strides for its narrative, and the other acts as an example of why different isn't always better. Starting with Baby, he may seem to not be too innovative at first, with his scientific origins seeming like a retread of Cell, and his liquefied regeneration seeming much like Boo. Baby doesn't rely on this familiarity alone though, as his character becomes more focused on Saiyan history and lore that anime had only briefly touched on. Before that reveal though, his possession differentiates itself from the absorption of those two, in it not being apparent when someone is possessed by him, unless he reveals himself, which makes the early encounters with him have elements of a tense thriller, as well as turning the Cell similarity on its head, with it soon being revealed that Mew was actually Baby's creation, who served the purpose of improving the latter as a Neo-Machine mutant. When the reveal that he is a Sifurian comes about, things become more nuanced, with him serving as a parallel to Frieza. Whereas Frieza enslaved and massacred the Saiyans, Baby is someone whose people were annihilated by the Saiyans, and therefore has a valid reason for wanting revenge on the surviving ones on Earth. People may cite Baby's method of mind control and possession as removing the nuance within what could have been Dragon Ball's most morally complex villain. While that is true to some extent, there's still some depth remaining in Baby's rationale behind it. Being the last survivor of his species, and not seeming capable of changing that the traditional way, melding those on Earth into a new race of Sifurians is his only option if wishing his kind to once more prosper. And the desire to do this regardless of the consequences is expected when having waited decades to enact his revenge. This eventually goes as far as to restore planet Sufru in order to see his people flourish once more. This gives him some level of a saviour complex, in him doing what he can to restore his people to their glory. Though he could have done this through wishing for their revival with the ultimate Dragon Balls, him not doing so shows Baby acknowledges the failings of his species, much as Goku acknowledges that the brutal Saiyans paid for their actions, and sees his Neo-Machine mutant self as the pinnacle of what a Sifurian can be, with his kingdom of Neo-Sifurians being a progress upon his race's failings. Unlike most other Dragon Ball villains who look at other species as inferior to them in every way, Baby acknowledges the Saiyan power his sworn enemies possess, which makes him determined to turn it against them, in making them new types of Sifurians, specifically Vegeta in making him his main host. This causes him to see his state after doing so as the perfect being, combining Saiyan brawn with Sifurian brains, before seeking to place his control upon the entire universe. Going back to Cell, Baby also acts as the Dragon Team's strength being turned against them, and the consequences of the past returning. Baby does so more physically in not only making Goku, Pan and Oob attacked by their family and friends, but his revenge death ball being an evil Genki Dama, which shows the power that can come from unity. As I mentioned in the video focusing on Super Saiyan 4 though, this ends up being his undoing, as reliance on the power of the enslaved rather than genuine bonds, combined with his own cultivation, causes Goku to eventually turn the tables on him. Overall, Baby shows not only the innovative steps that can come from inverting prior ideas, but also the degeneration of one's morals that can come from desires for revenge, and how saviour ideals can become ones of superiority. On the other hand, we have Zamasu, or Goku Black, to start. Black's appearance and role at the start of the Future Trunks arc made him the most mysterious villain the franchise had since Cell's introduction. That in itself presents the first problem with him though, as this level of build-up required just as great a payoff, and it just turns out Zamasu used the Super Dragon Balls to do what Ginyu did long before him. With Zamasu's introduction, and the events leading to the Zero Mortal plan. Things are underdeveloped and filled with incoherent character motivations. In the anime, you have Goasu believing it's a good idea to have someone with a negative view on mortals to fight and lose to a battle-hungry one. And Zamasu's motives in both the anime and manga are underdeveloped, with him seeing one species of mortals, researching Goku's fights, and not even meeting him beforehand in the manga, and then deciding that alone is enough to erase all mortals from the multiverse. When his future self actually collects the Super Dragon Balls, we also see another major problem with his character, being he's written as incredibly stupid for the most part, in not just wishing for his utopia in which all mortals don't exist or are the perfect servants, which would take far less time, risk and casualties than what he chose to do. Though it could have been written in a manner showing his sense of superiority and desire for power, this could only really apply to his highly undeveloped manga self, with the anime going out of its way to portray him as a pure-hearted individual that got radicalized by GodTube and avoided common sense or whatever. This leads into two more poorly handled aspects of him, one being his competency. Whereas other villains such as Frieza, Cell or Baby are undone by arrogance that their unchallenged position gives them good reason for, or by circumstances out of their control or field of knowledge, Zamasu and Black are defeated by their own incompetency in letting the Saiyans go during their fight, twice in the anime, in not quickly sensing the key of the Saiyans or nearby Earthlings to prevent this, as well as their anime self getting their physical body destroyed because they simply didn't just do what Boo did and take out all the Earthlings in one fell swoop. Their manga selves are at least competent enough to do this, except to Mai. But in both continuities, their delusions of grandeur make little sense, when known Zeno could eliminate them in an instant. And the end goal of the Zero Mortal plan come with the question of, what then? Just try and avoid punishment from Zeno or the Daishinkan? The other issue is in Zamasu's hypocrisy. Whereas Baby acknowledged the sire power of his hosts, Zamasu still rants about mortals while leeching off one, and issues in his Potara fusion coming about from the mortal influence on it. That's not to say hypocrisy itself adds to bad writing, as some of the most complex and well-written characters are such due to the hypocritical aspects of them. But the issue here is in both how obvious the hypocrisy is to anyone who thinks about the steps towards his motivation for a few seconds, and his reaction to being confronted with this hypocrisy essentially amounting to him throwing a hissy fit. Focusing on Black in particular, one thing that makes his potential unfulfilled, as well as adds a comparison to Baby, is in his lack of narrative weight as an antagonist to the main three Saiyans of the arc, as well as simply as an edgy evil Goku. The first is in him not fitting as an antagonist to Trunks, in him being completely separate from the identity or themes of Trunks and his timeline, and thereby being brought in as the major threat purely to bring in the nostalgia bait of future Trunks. He also acts as a foil to Vegeta, and only shows the issue in how Super handles him, with his attitude towards Black backtracking on his character growth in the Majin Buu arc. There's then his tie to Goku, in what could be an unnerving situation in the Dragon Team being forced to fight against what seems to be Goku, but it being a hollow conflict when he isn't Goku at all beyond appearance. Compare this to Baby building up a conflict with Goku prior to arriving on Earth, as well as the similarities between them I mentioned before, and how their conflict ties into the themes of Saiyan identity and collective strength, along with him tying into GT's most overarching theme of taking the Cell arc's focus on the consequences of the past, or what they relied on being brought against the Dragon Team, and cranking it up to 11. Him also possessing Vegeta's body without removing the latter's mind or soul also makes harming them a more difficult situation for Goku, as well as damaging his servants such as Goten being emotionally difficult for Pan. The difference is also clear in how their transformations are handled, as while Baby's strongest form transformations and Golden Ozaru present him as mutating Saiyan power into his own design to create something innovative, as well as draw upon the law of power systems concerning building upon what came before. Super Saiyan Rose Goku Black is little more than one of Super's many part swap transformations that adds nothing new to the themes of the arc or his character. Going back to the overarching topic topic of deviating from the norm. Another failure of Zamasu is that he only does this purely in terms of Dragon Ball villains, as the franchise hadn't really delved into deities antagonizing the Dragon Team in a very villainous manner, and it's easy to see why when this is an overdone character archetype in shonen. Even removing the poor execution of the premise, the idea that comes from Zamasu is no different from Poseidon or Hades from Saint Seiya, and taking out his divinity just makes him a less competent version of Sensui from Yu Yu Hakusho. All that said, Zamasu acts as a display of why different directions for a series aren't always good, as those familiar on the modern take of subverting expectations will be aware, and the importance of thinking more about an idea beyond the premise. Overall, comparing these two acts as a microcosm of my thoughts on GT and Super in general. Whereas GT can be seen as masterful ideas with lukewarm execution that occasionally live up to their goals now and then, as with Baby, Super is primarily mediocre ideas with terrible execution, with Zamasu being a shining example of this, even if still far from the worst of Super's villains. Thank you if haven't watched all the way through. If interested in another video surrounding Baby's events in GT, you may be interested in this analysis on Super Saiyan 4, or if wanting to hear about another failure of the Future Trunks arc, I cover its reset in this much older video concerning the ending of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Stone Ocean.